She raised her hand and brought it down across his face in front of 40 people, and the room went absolutely silent. Not the kind of silence that follows an accident, not the startled hush of spilled wine or a dropped glass. This was the silence of witnesses, the kind that settles over a room when everyone present understands, simultaneously, that something has just gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. Some of them stared at the woman who had done it. Some of them stared at the man who had received it. And a few of them, the ones who knew, the ones who had recognized him the moment he walked through the door, stared at their shoes because they understood exactly what was about to unfold, and they did not want to be caught watching. The man's name was Daniel Ashworth. He was 38 years old, and he was standing in the middle of the Meridian Group's annual winter gala, with his left cheek burning and his hands perfectly still at his sides. He had not flinched. He had not stepped back. He simply stood there, with the particular stillness of a man who has decided, long ago, how he intends to behave when the world tests him, and this, whatever else it was certainly a test. The woman who had slapped him was his wife. Her name was Renata, and if you had asked her, in that moment, whether she had made a mistake, she would have told you no. She would have told you that Daniel had embarrassed her, that he had shown up to her most important professional event of the year dressed like he was attending a weekend barbecue, dark jeans, a simple navy sweater, clean boots, and that she had specifically told him to dress appropriately. She would have told you that her boss, Clifford Hale, had been watching, and that Clifford Hale's opinion was the single most important variable in the trajectory of her career, and that Daniel, by existing in his casual, unbothered way, had threatened that trajectory. She would have told you the slap was necessary, a correction, a signal. What Renata did not know, what she had somehow, catastrophically, failed to understand, was that Clifford Hale was not the most powerful man in that room. Daniel was. Before we go any further, I want to take just a moment to welcome you here. If this is your first time joining us, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and there are so many more stories coming that I think you're going to want to be here for. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that ballroom, you have to understand how Daniel Ashworth came to be standing in it, and why no one on his wife's side of their life had any idea who he really was. Daniel had grown up with very little, not the romantic kind, of very little that gets softened in the retelling, not a humble house with love in the walls and wisdom in the garden. His childhood was genuinely hard. An absent father, a mother who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't always cover the utilities, apartments that changed every 18 months when the landlord's patience ran out. He had learned early that the world did not adjust itself for people like him, and that the only reliable architecture in a precarious life was the structure you built yourself, quietly, brick by brick, while no one was paying attention. He was brilliant in a specific, unglamorous way that doesn't get celebrated in school. Not performative brilliance, not the kind that raises hands and wins debates, but the kind that sits in the back and sees everything. He had a mind for systems, for understanding how things connected, how money moved, how organizations breathed. He got a scholarship to study business and finance at a university where most of his classmates had been preparing their whole lives, and he was preparing in real time. He graduated in the top 3 of his cohort. He got a job at a mid-sized investment consultancy, and then, methodically, over the next 12 years, he built something. The Ashworth Holdings Group was not a household name, and that was entirely by design. Daniel had never wanted recognition. He had wanted solidity. The company held significant equity positions in 11 different businesses across commercial real estate, logistics infrastructure, and specialized financial services. The Meridian Group, the consulting firm where his wife Renata worked, the firm whose gala he was now standing inside, with a red handprint on his face, was one of those 11 businesses. Meridian's majority shareholder, through a series of holding structures that were publicly registered but rarely examined, was Ashworth Holdings. Daniel had acquired the controlling interest 4 years ago as part of a broader strategic consolidation. He had never once set foot in the building before tonight. Renata did not know any of this. It is worth pausing here to ask, how? How does a woman not know that her husband owns the company she works for? The answer is layered, and it says something important about the nature of their marriage. Daniel and Renata had met 6 years ago at a charity function. She had been polished, ambitious, magnetic. He had been quiet, attentive, and, to her visible assessment, modest. She'd assumed he was some kind of mid-level financial analyst. He'd describe his work vaguely, in the way people sometimes do when they don't want to make a dinner conversation into a business pitch. She'd found his quietness interesting at first. Later, she'd found it frustrating. She wanted a partner who projected success, who wore it, announced it, made it visible. Daniel simply lived inside his work and came home. He didn't display. He didn't perform. Over the years, Renata had drawn her own conclusions about what that meant. She decided he was comfortable but unremarkable, a stable, somewhat boring husband who managed investments in some small-scale capacity and who would never quite match her ambition or her energy. She had stopped asking about his work in any detail, partly out of disinterest and partly because he'd never offered the details in any way that seemed to invite them. He'd never corrected her assumptions. He'd never volunteered the scale of what he actually managed. Some people who heard this story later would say, why didn't he just tell her? And the honest answer is that he had tried early in the marriage to share more, to explain what he was building, what it meant, where it was going. And each time Renata had responded with the particular kind of polite disengagement that makes a person feel like their reality is being quietly rejected. She'd changed the subject. She'd moved on. And eventually, Daniel had stopped offering. The way you stop offering something to someone who consistently leaves it untouched on the plate. It wasn't secrecy, exactly. It was the learned silence of a man whose inner world had found no welcome in his marriage. But they remained married. There is a certain inertia to long relationships, a weight of shared history that keeps two people in proximity long after proximity is the only thing they still share. They had a house. They had routines. They had, from the outside, the shape of a life together. The invitation to the Meridian Gala had come through the normal channels. Renata had received hers through work, and she'd mentioned, somewhat offhandedly, that spouses were welcome. Daniel had decided to attend for reasons he had not shared with Renata and would not have been able to fully articulate even to himself. Perhaps it was curiosity about the organization he owned. Perhaps it was some residual hope that they might find in neutral social territory, some thread of connection they had lost. Perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps he was simply tired of the distance and wanted to try. He had dressed practically. He had not dressed to impress. He owned clothes that would have silenced any room he walked into, suits made by craftsmen in cities that Renata's colleagues would have recognized immediately as signals of a particular echelon of wealth. He had not worn those. He'd put on what he found comfortable because he had never believed that clothing was the announcement of a man's worth, and because some part of him, perhaps naively, had hoped that Renata had married him understanding the same thing. She had not. He arrived at the gala venue. The Meridian Group had taken over the top 2 floors of the Aldermere Hotel, a beautiful space, all dark wood and warm light and long windows overlooking the city, and found Renata immediately in the crowd. She was in a deep green dress, talking with animation to a group of colleagues, and for a moment, seeing her there, he felt something warm and almost hopeful. He crossed the room toward her. The warmth on her face, when she turned and saw him, lasted exactly 2 seconds. He watched it happen, the light recognition, followed by the slide of her gaze, down and up his outfit, followed by the flicker of something that was not warmth at all. She excused herself from her colleagues and stepped toward him, and her voice, when she reached him, was low and controlled, in the way that meant she was already angry. "What are you wearing?" she said. It was not a question. "Good evening to you too," he said. "Daniel, I told you, business formal. This is not business formal. This is, you look like you came to help someone move furniture." He looked down at himself. Clean jeans, a cashmere navy sweater, good boots. He was, by any normal human standard, appropriately dressed for an upscale evening event. "I look fine," he said. "You look like my husband, who doesn't care enough to make an effort," she said. "Clifford is going to be here tonight. His opinion matters to my promotion. I needed you to not embarrass me." He had heard this particular sentence, or versions of it, many times over the past 2 years. Clifford Hale, the chief executive of Meridian, had become the central character in Renata's working life, referenced so frequently that Daniel sometimes felt that Clifford occupied more space in their marriage than he himself did. He understood ambition, genuinely, but there was something in the constant invocation of another man's opinion as the measure of everything that had begun to wear on him in ways he couldn't quite name. "I'm not here to embarrass you," he said quietly. "I'm here because you invited me. I invited the version of you I thought might show up," she said, and turned back toward her colleagues. He stayed because leaving felt worse. He circulated. He spoke to people who spoke to him, and several people did speak to him with a particular quality of attention, a directness in the eyes that suggested they were trying to place him, trying to reconcile who he appeared to be with some other information they were holding. He collected a drink and found a quiet spot near the window and watched the room with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. Clifford Hale arrived 40 minutes into the evening, and the room reorganized itself around him the way rooms do when someone who holds authority enters. He was 60, well-built, silver-haired, with the loud and practiced warmth of a man who has learned that performing friendliness is a form of power. He moved through the crowd with the court forming behind him, accepting greetings with the nod of a minor king. Renata found Clifford within moments. Daniel watched from across the room as she inserted herself into his circle, watched her laugh at the right moments, lean forward at the right moments, perform the complicated and exhausting choreography of professional courtship. He felt, watching her, not jealousy but something closer to sadness. He wondered when she had last been that animated in a room where impressing someone wasn't the goal. He was somewhere in the middle of this thought when Clifford Hale looked across the room directly at him and went very still. Daniel held the man's gaze. He lifted his glass slightly in a minimal greeting. Clifford excused himself from the group he was in and began moving in Daniel's direction, and Daniel could see even from a distance that Clifford's expression had done something complicated. Shock moving through recognition, moving through something that looked very much like alarm. Renata saw Clifford moving and followed his trajectory to its destination, to Daniel. She was at his side within 30 seconds, arriving just as Clifford reached Daniel, and she was already opening her mouth to offer some managing introduction, some protective translation. She intended to present Daniel as her pleasant, modest husband to minimize the damage of his outfit with a charming explanation to steer the conversation somewhere safe. She did not get the chance. "Mr. Ashworth," Clifford Hale said, and his voice had the stripped quality of a man whose performance has briefly failed him. "I had no idea you'd be attending tonight. We're honored to have you." Renata stopped. Clifford extended his hand with the kind of genuine, deep deference that is absolutely unmistakable, the kind that cannot be faked or manufactured, the kind that flows from one place only, the place where someone understands, in their bones, who holds power in a given exchange. Daniel shook his hand. "Good evening, Clifford." It seemed like a good event to see the team in action. Renata was standing 8 inches to Daniel's left, and she was very, very still. Of course, Clifford was saying, and his voice had recovered somewhat, reassembling its practiced warmth, but now oriented differently, pointed at a different target. "And is this your He looked at Renata with an expression that carried the faint, fresh curiosity of a man rearranging a filing cabinet in real time. "My wife," Daniel said, "Renata. I believe she's a senior consultant in the Strategic Advisory Division." The word "believe." He had used it with precision. Clifford turned to Renata with an expression that she would spend the following weeks trying to decode and said, of course, Renata. Yes, fine work on the Blackwell report, which was the thing people in positions of power say when they are buying themselves time to think." Renata smiled, but Daniel could see in the corner of his vision that it was the effortful smile of a woman who has just discovered that a room she thought she understood has a room inside it that she never knew existed. Clifford excused himself a few minutes later. He had the taut movement of a man with urgent business, and Daniel and Renata stood together in a newly unusual silence. He could feel the question gathering in her, the enormous and specific questions she was not yet ready to ask out loud in this particular room, surrounded by her colleagues. Instead of asking it, she grabbed his forearm and steered him toward a relatively quiet corner near the bar, and then she turned to him with a look that was still sorting itself between fury and something more uncertain. Before she could say anything, two of her colleagues appeared, Marcus and Priya, senior consultants, both, people she had worked alongside for 3 years, and Marcus said, with a tone that carried its own complicated layers, "Renata, is that your husband? Did you know?" And then he glanced at Daniel and redirected mid-sentence, with the instinct of a man who has realized he's about to say something he shouldn't, and said instead, "Good to meet you. I'm Marcus." Priya had gone slightly pink. She shook Daniel's hand with the startled courtesy of someone who had just done a rapid internal calculation. Renata looked between her husband and her colleagues, and she said with a laugh that was working too hard, "Daniel was just explaining himself to me. Actually, he dressed a little casually tonight. I keep telling him, 'You look perfectly comfortable,'" Priya said to Daniel, with the careful neutrality of a woman who has chosen not to participate in whatever is happening. "I think," Marcus said, to no one in particular, "I need another drink." The next 20 minutes were a kind of suspended state, like the moment after lightning, but before thunder, where everything is charged and nothing has quite yet resolved. Daniel continued to circulate. He spoke to people who spoke to him with that particular attentiveness. Renata moved alongside him with the expression of a woman recataloguing a house she thought she knew and finding unfamiliar rooms behind familiar walls. And then the situation descended. It arrived in the form of Gregory Hale, Clifford's son, also employed at Meridian in some nominally senior capacity that everyone understood had been created rather than earned. Gregory was 32, handsome in an obvious way and possessed of the unearned confidence that grows in people who have never been seriously questioned. He had apparently heard something, some fragment of conversation, some half-assembled version of what Clifford had communicated, and he arrived with the specific mission of establishing hierarchy in the only way he knew how. He inserted himself between Daniel and the conversation Daniel was having with two of Meridian's department heads and said, loudly enough to be heard by the surrounding cluster of people, "So, you're Renata's husband? The financial analyst?" He made it sound like a man who repairs bicycles had wandered into a Formula One garage. "I work in finance," Daniel said. Right, Gregory said, with a smile that wasn't. "This event is really for Meridian staff and their partners. You know, it's not really the sort of thing where the plus ones kind of hold court, if you know what I mean." He looked at Daniel's outfit in the way that people look at things they have decided in advance to find inferior. Dad keeps the door pretty tight on who gets real face time here. The room around them had done the thing rooms do. It had organized itself to witness without appearing to. Conversations had slowed. People had angled slightly inward. Daniel looked at Gregory Hale with the measured patience of a man who has learned to recognize the difference between a threat and an inconvenience. He said nothing immediately. He let the silence do some work. Renata was behind him, and slightly to the left. He was aware of her, the way you are aware of a door that hasn't opened. Renata, Gregory said, including her with the easy authority of a man who is confident in his own gravity. You should probably tell your husband how these things work. Bit embarrassing having him hovering around the principles, isn't it? And this was the moment. This was the specific, identifiable, devastating moment that Renata would have rearranged anything to be able to go back and undo. Because Gregory Hale was the son of Clifford Hale. Because Clifford Hale's good opinion was the architecture of Renata's professional ambition. Because she had spent 3 years carefully building a specific impression in this specific man's family, and now her casually dressed husband was being framed as an embarrassment, and in that fraction of a second, she chose. She turned to Daniel, and she brought her right hand across his left cheek, sharply, in front of the room. Gregory is right, she said, in a voice that was trying to be light, but was fracturing at the edges. You're embarrassing me. Just stand somewhere and be quiet, please. The room was silent. Daniel turned his head back from the direction the blow had carried it. His cheek carried the heat of it. His eyes were very calm. He looked at Renata for a long moment with an expression she would later describe as the most frightening thing she had ever seen on a human face. Not because it was angry, but because it wasn't. It was clear. It was finished. It was the face of a man who has received the answer to a question he'd been asking for years. He looked then at Gregory, who had gone several shades lighter and was not smiling anymore. And Daniel Ashworth straightened, adjusted the cuff of his completely acceptable cashmere sweater, and said quietly, and without theater, "I appreciate the clarity." Then he walked calmly and directly to find Clifford Hale. The conversation between Daniel and Clifford happened in a small meeting room off the main corridor, where Clifford had retreated to make a phone call. Daniel knocked, entered, and within 10 minutes, the shape of everything had shifted on its axis. There was no dramatics to report because there never were. With Daniel, he laid out what he needed to lay out. Clifford, to his credit, listened. The man was not foolish. He understood, with the practiced radar of a long career executive, exactly what he was hearing and what it implied, and his face moved through its calculations with the speed of someone who has survived corporate life by being faster than events. When Daniel returned to the main hall, the room had not recovered. People were still processing. There were the tight conversations of people who share information quickly when something significant has occurred. Heads together, voices low, expressions occupied. Renata was standing with Priya and Marcus, and the three of them were engaged in what appeared to be an extremely uncomfortable exchange. Gregory Hale had located his father and was speaking to him with the urgent body language of a young man who needs reassurance, and Clifford was giving him the particular response of a father who has just discovered that his son has struck a match next to something flammable and enormous. Renata saw Daniel return across the room, and she came to him immediately, cutting through the space between them with steps that were faster than she intended, and when she reached him, she said his name in a voice that was stripped of everything it usually carried: the management, the performance, the management of the performance. It was just his name, raw and uncertain. "We should go," he said. "Daniel." "Not here," he said. "Not in this room." They left. But he helped her with her coat at the door in the automatic way of a man whose manners run deeper than his feelings in that particular moment, and they went down in the elevator in silence, and the silence followed them through the lobby and out to the street where the winter air came off the city in long, cold currents. They stood on the pavement, and Renata said, "Tell me." "Tell you what?" "Tell me what?" Clifford meant when he said, "Tell me what's happening. Tell me what I don't know." She stopped. Her breath clouded in the cold air. "Tell me what Gregory's face looked like when you walked away." Daniel looked at her for a moment. The glow of the Aldermere's entrance fell across the side of her face, and she looked, in that light, like someone who has just understood that they have been walking on glass without knowing it, and has now heard it begin to crack. He told her about Ashworth Holdings, about the 11 equity positions, about Meridian's majority shareholder structure, about the acquisition 4 years ago, the holding registrations, the board documentation she could verify with any search. He told her in the same plain, methodical way he had always talked about his work when he talked about it, without theater, without vindication in his voice, without the satisfaction of watching her understand. He simply laid the facts out the way an architect lays out a blueprint. Here is what exists. Here is how it was built. Here is what it means. Renata stood very still through all of it. When he finished, she said nothing for a long time. The street moved around them, a cab, a couple walking fast against the cold, someone's distant laughter. "You own it," he finally said. "The controlling interest?" "Yes." "You own the company I work for?" "Yes." "And you've? For how long?" "But 4 years." Another silence. He watched her doing the arithmetic of the past 4 years, overlaying this information against everything she remembered from that period, and he could see it on her face, the way the picture rearranged itself, everything shifting by a millimeter, taking on a completely different shape while keeping all the same pieces. Every conversation she'd had about Clifford, every complaint she'd brought home about office politics, every plan she'd mapped out for her career within an organization that her husband, sitting quietly across the dinner table, had owned. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said, and her voice had something young and wounded in it. And this was the question he had expected, and he had thought about how to answer it, because the answer was important, and he did not want to be cruel with it, even now with his cheek still warm from her hand. "I tried," he said. "In the beginning, you remember, I tried to explain what I was working on, what the company was building, how significant it was becoming. And every time I started, you'd redirect, you'd change the subject. You'd mention something about your day, or about Clifford's feedback on your latest project. You didn't ask. And eventually, I stopped offering what wasn't being asked for." She opened her mouth and closed it again. "I'm not saying that to wound you," he said. "I'm saying it because you asked why, and that's the true answer." The ride home was in a car, he called. She sat on the far side of the back seat with her hands in her lap, looking out the window at the city passing, and he sat on his side and looked at the same city from his window, and the space between them on the seat was approximately 18 inches and felt like considerably more. The days that followed were among the strangest of Daniel's life, not dramatic in the visible sense, but charged with the particular electricity of a situation that is reorganizing itself, while no one is quite certain what shape it will take. Renata did not go into the office the next day. She called in with a planned appointment. She spent the day in the house, and Daniel, who worked largely from a home office, could hear her moving through the rooms, a particular restlessness, a circling quality, like someone mapping territory that has turned out to be different than the map they'd been using. She came to his office door in the early afternoon and stood in the doorway and said, "I need to say things to you." He turned from his screen. All right, she had prepared. He could see that she had organized her thoughts with the same precision she brought to her professional work, and she laid them out now with a deliberateness that he actually respected, even under the circumstances. She said she had been wrong to treat his quietness as inadequacy. She had been wrong to measure his worth by the performance of it. She had been wrong to spend their marriage competing for the approval of a man who, she now understood, occupied a position of power only relative to her husband's indifference to exercising his own. She said that what she had done at the party was wrong in every available dimension, not because of what she now knew about Meridian and Ashworth Holdings, but because there was no version of their marriage, no version of any human relationship, where what she had done was acceptable. She said this clearly, and without using the word but. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "I believe you mean that. I do mean it. The question," he said carefully, "is what we do now." Because I think we have been living in different marriages for quite some time, Renata. And the event last night, that didn't create that. It just made it impossible to ignore. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you telling me it's over?" "I'm telling you, I don't know," he said. And it was the truest thing he'd said to her in months, possibly years. I think we need to be honest about what we've become to each other. And I think that's a conversation that deserves more than one sitting at Meridian. Things moved with the efficiency that significant organizational realignments tend to produce. Word travels in professional environments at a speed that no memo ever matches. And by the morning after the gala, the essential fact that Renata's husband was, in the most structural sense available, the man above all the men in that building, had dispersed through the organization with the thoroughness of weather. Clifford Hale called Renata on the third day. The conversation, she told Daniel afterward, was one of the most uncomfortable 20 minutes of her professional life, not because Clifford was unkind, but because he was careful, and his carefulness had an entirely new quality to it. The easy authority of his approval had been replaced by something more considered, more precisely weighted. He expressed, with considerable professionalism, his regret for the environment that the gala had produced. He made no reference to Gregory. He spoke with the particular fluency of a man who understands that everything has changed and is choosing his language accordingly. Gregory Hale took a leave of absence from Meridian 11 days after the gala. The official communication cited personal development objectives. The unofficial version, which moved through the organization in the same efficient way as everything else, was that this had been strongly encouraged from a level above Clifford's usual sightline. Daniel had not mandated this. He had not, in fact, mandated anything at Meridian specifically in response to the events of that evening. What he had done in his conversation with Clifford on the night of the gala was make certain things clear: the nature of his ownership position, his general philosophy of governance, his expectations around the culture and conduct standards of organizations he had a stake in. He had been precise, and he had been fair, and he had not made the conversation about himself, or his cheek, or his wife. He had simply been the person he always was, which was someone who understood power well enough not to need to announce it. The consequences arranged themselves around those clarities without requiring further direction from him. Priya came to Renata privately about a week after the event. She sat down with her in a quiet corner of the office kitchen with 2 cups of tea, and she said, without preamble, "I didn't do anything that night when Gregory was talking to your husband, and I should have. I want to say that to you, directly. I knew it was wrong, and I stood there, and I'm sorry." Renata thanked her. She meant it. There was something about Priya's admission that cracked open a space Renata had been defending, and they sat together for longer than either of them had planned, talking not about the gala, but about other things, about what it was like to work in a place where approval came from specific directions, and you shaped yourself around those directions. Couldn't always find the original shape anymore. Marcus never said anything directly, but he started treating Daniel. On the 2 occasions, Daniel came to the Meridian offices in the following month with a visible and genuine respect that did not appear to be performance. He was the kind of man who processed things internally and expressed the result through changed behavior rather than spoken admission, and Daniel found he respected that. Daniel did come to the Meridian offices twice initially, not to assert anything, not to walk the halls as a signal, but because he had decided, in the aftermath of all of this, that the habit of invisibility he had cultivated was not purely a virtue. It had kept him private. It had also kept him isolated in his own life. If he was honest with himself, and he was, always, rigorous about honesty with himself, some part of the situation with Renata had been enabled by his own choice to remain unseen. He couldn't be the only architect of the distance between them. He and Renata began conversations, not reconciliation conversations. Exactly. They weren't working from a script that called for resolution, but honest ones. The kind they had not had in years, maybe ever. He told her more about his work, its scope, what it had taken to build. She told him more about what it had been like to feel, for years, like she was carrying the visible ambition for both of them, not understanding that the ambition she was working toward was, structurally, within what her husband already held. There was some bitterness in those conversations. There was also, occasionally, the kind of genuine recognition that two intelligent people can reach when they stop managing each other. Whether the marriage would survive was not a question with a clean answer yet. They had agreed to seek outside counsel, a therapist who saw them individually at first and then together, and who was skilled enough to hold the complexity of what they were navigating without forcing it toward a resolution before one was available. The honest accounting of what Daniel had received on the night of the gala and what it said about where they were was something neither of them could hurry, but there were moments, small ones. A dinner where the conversation ran long past the point where food was the reason they were still at the table. A morning where she asked him, with what seemed like genuine curiosity, rather than social obligation, about a decision he was weighing at one of the other companies in the holdings portfolio, and he answered fully, without the careful abbreviation he had learned, and she listened in the way that he had almost forgotten she was capable of. Moments that were not a marriage, repaired but were something, were threads maybe, that might be woven back into something, or might not, but were at least being offered and received. 6 weeks after the gala, Daniel sat in his home office late on a Tuesday evening, with the work of the day finished and the house quiet. He was not a man given to extensive self-examination. He found it less productive than forward motion, but he allowed himself, in that stillness, some reflection on how completely the landscape of his life had altered in a single hour at a hotel on a winter night. He thought about Renata's hand crossing his face. He thought about the silence that followed. He thought about the look on Gregory Hale's face when he turned and walked away. He thought about Clifford's handshake, the weight of genuine deference in it, the years of organizational gravity that a handshake like that carried. He thought about what it had cost him, all of it, and what it had clarified. He had never wanted to be known for his money. He had never wanted his worth measured by it. He had wanted to be known the way anyone wants to be known, through consistent character, through the quality of his attention, through how he treated people across the long, ordinary span of a life. He still believed these things. He would always believe them, but he understood. Now, with the clarity that the whole strange evening had delivered, that there is a difference between choosing not to display power and choosing not to exist. He had made himself so thoroughly invisible in the spaces of his own life that the person who was supposed to know him best had looked at him and seen someone dismissible. That was not humility. That had been, in its own way, a kind of abdication. The man he wanted to be was present, visible, known, not announced, but knowable, and default. He was going to practice being that man in his marriage, if the marriage endured, and in his life regardless. He closed his laptop. He went downstairs. Renata was in the kitchen with a book, the way she sometimes was at this hour, and she looked up when he came in, and there was a particular quality in the look, an openness, a readiness for whatever came next. He made tea for both of them without being asked. He sat down across from her. He said, "Tell me about your day," and she told him. It's a strange thing, isn't it, how the moments that break something open are so rarely the ones we planned for. Daniel didn't walk into that gala intending revelation. Renata didn't wake up that morning intending to make the worst decision of her marriage. Gregory Hale certainly didn't intend to become an object lesson in the catastrophic cost of measuring people by their surface. But intentions and outcomes so rarely share the same geography, and what that room witnessed in those few charged minutes was the unraveling of a set of assumptions that had been waiting, quietly, for exactly the right pressure to give way. The real question at the center of this story is not about money or power or even the specific wrongness of what Renata did. As clear as that wrongness was, the real question is about what we choose to see in the people we're closest to. Whether we look at them, or only at the version of them we've already decided is true. Whether we create the conditions in our most important relationships where a person can be fully known, or whether we make the space so conditional that the other person stops offering themselves into it. There are people watching this story right now who recognize something in it, not necessarily the dramatic architecture of it, not the holdings companies and the winter galas, but the feeling at the center. The feeling of being in a room with someone you love and being invisible to them. The quiet exhaustion of that. The particular loneliness of being underestimated by someone who had every opportunity and every reason to see you clearly. If you recognize that feeling, I hope this story offered something. Not a prescription, not a blueprint, but maybe a reminder that clarity, when it finally comes, is not always destruction. Sometimes it is the only foundation solid enough to build anything real upon. Thank you so much for spending this time here with me. If this story moved you, or made you think, or made you want to say something, please do leave a comment. I read them. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me whether you think Daniel and Renata found their way back to each other or whether you think some fractures don't mend. And if you haven't already, a like and a subscription mean more to this channel than I can easily express. They are what allow these stories to keep being told. There are more coming, and I promise you, they are worth waiting for.